Hello everyone. Tonight we'll start by discussing the Vikings' incredible fortitude and, let's say, inventive ability to tolerate suffering. They miraculously survived the frigid Scandinavian winters without the use of central heating. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. The Vikings did not fear when it became completely cold outside. They just went back to their longhouses, which were big, low, and just somewhat less breathable than a contemporary sauna constructed in a cow barn. The Vikings' equivalent of winter bunkers were these longhouses. They were built low to the ground to retain heat and wide enough to house several families, and occasionally a few carefully positioned cows, because nothing says comfort like sleeping next to something that farts steam and chews cud. They were mainly made of timber if you lived close to trees, or turf and stone if you didn't. The warmth of the group was essential to enduring the cold. Imagine a longhouse as a single communal thermal battery with a fire pit, animal and human bodies, and all of this functioning in comfortable, unventilated harmony. It was more of a survival snuggle bunker than a dwelling. The hearth, which served as a space heater and stove, stretched through the middle of the longhouse. Since chimneys had not yet been invented, or, more precisely, they had not yet been invented in areas where people still used bones as doortops, there were no chimneys. Rather, the entire ceiling turned black, and everyone's lungs became ashtrays coated with wool as smoke climbed and gathered in the rafters, sometimes escaping through a hole in the roof or remaining exactly where it was. Viking dwellings may appear crammed, strangely close and excessively smoky to contemporary eyes, and for good reason. However, it was the best alternative to turning into a snow sculpture for the Vikings. The walls were lined with raised sleeping platforms that were frequently filled with moss, straw, or anything else that was soft and somewhat combustible. Families shared a sleeping area, and occasionally their goats did too. Not because they were much in love, but rather because privacy had not yet been created and warmth was a necessity. To put it briefly, Viking longhouses were functional but uncomfortable. Even if they didn't keep individuals very perfumed or rested, they kept them alive during harsh winters. Viking attire was more about avoiding freezing to death before breakfast than it was about runway elegance. The Norse had a better understanding of layering than they did of raiding. We're talking full-body wool armor reinforced with fur, leather, and an absolute lack of shame, and not just in a scarf and mittens sense. The foundational layer, if you were fortunate enough to have linen, that is. Light and breathable, linen effectively wicks away perspiration. Unfortunately, most people skipped right to wool because it was costly to produce and tore quickly. Wool, lots of it. Viking males wore leg wraps, which were essentially antiquated thermal tights over tunics and pants. Women placed cloaks and aprons over long woolen garments. Everyone used pouches to hold necessary items and belts to keep everything together. Perhaps a piece of emergency cheese, flint, or knives. Cloaks were necessary. Brooches, which were occasionally fur-lined, were used to secure them. And if you didn't have one, you most likely didn't have much time left either. Animal skin, usually from cattle or seals, was used to make boots, which were then waterproofed with copious amounts of fat. Viking shoes were windproof and grease-sealed, but they were ugly. The sole drawback? You had a jerky factory odor. Intestines were occasionally employed to create waterproof layers for the truly committed. Real animal intestines, indeed, sewed into a sort of prototype raincoat after being cleaned, scraped, and dried. No one would question your attire when you were practically dressed in internal organs, and even if it wasn't breathable, it did keep out rain and snow. Standard items like scarves, mittens, and hats were frequently made of felted wool, which was wool hammered until it lost its structural integrity and turned into a thick, warm mat. You hid your hands in your coat and prayed no one saw your fingers turning blue if you didn't have gloves. The Vikings had a single food rule that helped them survive the chilly Scandinavian nights. You should eat as if your life depended on it, because it does. Calories were insulation, not pleasure. Despite its lack of elegance, Viking winter food was rich, thick, and almost brutally utilitarian. Let's begin with the fundamentals: grain, meat, dairy, and seafood, preserves. An enormous amount of preserved fish. They salted, dried, fermented, smoked, and then they apologized to no one. Whitefish, marinated in lye until it's equal parts food, and dare is known as lutefisk. Not that tasty, but remarkably resistant to spoiling. Stews were the preferred option for heartier meals. Whatever they possessed, the Vikings tossed it into a pot over the fireplace. Root vegetables, cereals, pork cuts, and even sour milk. It was better the longer it cooked. Although the outcome was unglamorous, it adhered to your ribs and might have adhered to the bowl. A year-round staple, dairy was particularly important during the winter months. Butter and cheese were produced in the hot months and kept for use in cold season rationing. Not the lovely, creamy brie variety either. Think tough, salty, wheel-shaped survival pucks made of milk, ideal for trade, chewing, or throwing at wolves. Additionally, they produced sky, which was a sort of cheese and yogurt, and was undoubtedly a Viking take on the saying, "You'll eat it, and you'll be grateful." It was extremely sour and high in protein, making it the culinary equivalent of a face slap. Energizing, but perplexing. Bulk grains were kept in storage. Porridge and flatbreads were made from barley and rye. In order to stretch the flour further, crushed tree bark was occasionally used to Viking bread, which was dense and dark. Again, it wasn't very palatable, but it was effective if your blood sugar remained above freezing. Lastly, booze. Mead and ale weren't only for parties. When your toes were numb, they were incredibly soothing, calorie-dense, and moderately antibacterial. Mead in particular let you forget that you had 6 relatives and 6 animals living in a smoke-filled shed. Even better, no one would steal your leftovers if it tasted awful. When winter arrived, as it always did in Scandinavia, Vikings resorted to their most dependable source of warmth, other mammals. Keeping animals indoors was seen as practical rather than strange. Viking longhouses welcomed pigs, lambs, goats, chickens, and even cattle, not for company, but for body warmth. Imagine it as mooing-powered central heating in the Middle Ages. The byre, which is basically the garage meat stable part of the longhouse, was where the livestock were typically kept. Humans and animals were kept somewhat apart by a modest partition wall. We also imply that they should be close enough to smell, but not close enough to pet without causing trouble. Boundaries became blurred on icy nights. A family may gather nearer the byre, kids may take a nap next to a sheep. Congratulations! That was your cushion now if the ox was warm and willing, unquestionably effective, but not cozy. The reasoning was straightforward. Heat is produced by animals. A cow doesn't need kindling and can provide as much warmth as a small bonfire. In severe weather, such warmth could mean the difference between waking up severely irritated by the snoring pig and waking up frostbitten. The side effects were less appealing, of course. The noise, the smell, and the occasional hoof in the wrong place were all things you had to cope with. The Vikings didn't moan, though. They recognized a universal reality, now warmth, later dignity. Heat wasn't the only factor either. Animals that were kept close were shielded from predators, thievery, and freezing to death outside. In one shaggy, hay-eating package, livestock served as a family's source of income, food, and heating. Longhouses were frequently built with this in mind. Warmth from the byre was purposefully directed toward the dwelling areas by the builders. It was a survival instinct that led to architecture. Easy, efficient, and unreservedly fragrant. Vikings were more than just cold-hardy people. They bore it with a disconcerting degree of joy. You had each other as a last line of defense against the cold. Even after the fire had gone out, the goats had become grumpy, and the smoke had converted your longhouse into a BBQ pit. Huddling was a form of community engineering, not merely comfort. On elevated platforms, families slept next to each other, covered in layers of wool, and whatever leftover hide was not being used to repair the roof. There was no such thing as privacy. There was talk of comfort. However, warmth, they shared that. Kids tucked in between grown-ups. Older people were regarded as hot artifacts. Cats and dogs weren't kept as pets. They were whiskered thermal devices. Pretending not to hear Uncle Bjorn snoring like a wounded elk, everyone huddled in, breathing each other's smoky, cabbage-scented air. However, this went beyond mere bodily survival. Isolation throughout the winter can damage your mind more quickly than your toes. Viking humor, which was harsh, direct, and oddly powerful, filled that gap. They performed songs and narrated sagas, frequently about valiant warriors freezing to death, which somehow cheered everyone up. With no filter and razor-sharp humor, they roasted each other. Making fun of your cousin for falling in the latrine last week is the best way to combat seasonal depression. Another crucial morale-boosting activity was feasting. Food that had been stored since fall was brought out in large quantities during the middle of winter, not only to celebrate Yule, but also to let everyone know that we were still alive and that there were turnips. The Vikings often played games and contests indoors, sometimes involving wrestling sessions that occasionally toppled over the animals, board games akin to proto-chess with more treachery, or riddles. It was more than just entertainment. It served as a diversion from the bitter cold, the gloom, and the very real prospect of an unfulfilled spring. Most importantly, though, they made it through winter because they anticipated it would be difficult. No whining or feeling entitled to comfort was present. The default option was misery. Better was an added benefit. Today's insulation consists of high-tech materials like fiberglass, foam, or other materials with recognizable brand names and warning labels. There was no such luxury among the Vikings. They had a straightforward insulating plan. Incorporate as much of nature as you can into your walls and hope for the best. It was no coincidence that a Viking longhouse was a drafty shanty. In a way, it was intentional. Using whatever materials were available, these houses were designed to retain heat. If you lived close to a forest, you would use timber. If not, you would use turf and stone. The purpose of the thick, occasionally 1-meter walls was to retain heat by any means necessary. They put moss, straw, clay, or animal hair between the logs or stones. Anything thick, fibrous, and somewhat warm-smelling was crammed into the crevices. Although it wasn't glitzy and you definitely didn't want to stand barefoot leaning on the walls, it worked. Roofs were frequently thatched or, better yet, covered in layers of sod, which is simply earth and grass. This was not a design fad among eco-hipsters. Turf roofs were good for insulation, did a fair job of shedding water, and sometimes sprouted mushrooms or weeds when conditions were right. Growing plants indoors, perhaps. Unintentional salad bar, maybe. Typically, the floor was made of compacted soil, occasionally covered with rushes or straw that were changed out from time to time. Whenever the stink could no longer be justified as rustic, we use the term periodically. If there were windows at all, they were few and tiny. Fire or well-placed smoke holes provided light. Why are there no large windows? Drafts were fatal, glass was costly, and natural light was of little importance to Vikings, since it was dark outside for 3 months. Nevertheless, this shoddy assortment of turf, wood, and biological fluff worked rather well. It transformed a longhouse into a slow cooker that could weather the Scandinavian winter thanks to goat breath and shared body heat. It wasn't a spa. You couldn't breathe in it. It most likely failed all contemporary building codes. However, it was warm enough to keep Viking families alive and sufficiently smoky to fool insects and preserve their food. Vikings used a tried-and-true strategy to stay alive at night when the fire was low and the wind howled outside like a vengeful ice demon. You should sleep as if your life depended on it. Vikings slept in greater thermal mass strategies rather than private bedrooms. On the high wooden platforms that lined the longhouse walls, whole families slept, occasionally including distant relatives and any sick cattle. Fur, wool, and resignation were laid over these beds, which were covered with hay, moss, or straw. No embroidered pillowcases, duvets, or sheets were present. It went on the bed if it was gentle and didn't bite. All of them slept in their clothing. Layers remained in place because changing into pajamas in below-freezing temps was an excellent way to become a Viking popsicle. In other cases, boots were even worn to bed. If that seems absurd, keep in mind that frostbite doesn't give a damn about your self-respect. Babies were wrapped in blankets and kept near. Children were frequently positioned between parents or older siblings for the sole purpose of providing logistical insulation, not for emotional attachment. In essence, it was a meatloaf of people and wool the size of a family. Of course, couples slept together, but anyone who could fit in did as well. There was no emphasis on modesty. It was warm. It wasn't scandal if someone's feet strayed a little. It was survival. Similar to medieval heat blankets, wool cloaks were thrown over bodies. An additional layer of warmth was provided by animal hides, particularly those of bears or reindeer. You were either extremely wealthy, extremely fortunate, or highly dedicated to hunting frightful creatures in the winter if you owned a bearskin blanket. Underbedding, hot stones or bricks were occasionally used in affluent homes or during really harsh winters. The Vikings did have a hot water bottle, but it was heavier and more prone to burn your thigh. And what if the hearth's fire went out in the middle of the night? You didn't light it again right away. In Old Norse, you whispered something that presumably meant, "Don't you dare steal the fur again," and drew someone closer. To put it briefly, it wasn't glamorous to sleep in a Viking longhouse. It had a 100% likelihood of snoring, was smoky, and was cramped. However, it was successful. Theoretically, smoke was meant to ascend and exit through a vent close to the top of the building or the thatched roof. In reality, like an unwelcome visitor, it clung to the rafters and gradually seeped into everyone's lungs. In a Viking home, you didn't breathe fresh air. The air you inhaled was experienced. Your chest felt like it had smoked a hog shoulder by the conclusion of a winter evening. The pork shoulder did the same. Surprisingly, this wasn't entirely negative. Fish and meats hanging from the rafters were preserved by the smoke. It also warded against mold and insects. Furthermore, every Viking most likely had the respiratory system of a Victorian coal miner due to the continuous low-level exposure. The drawbacks, however, were difficult to overlook. Ceilings dyed darker than Odin's mood, hacking coughs and red eyes. Due to their diminutive stature and proximity to the densest smoke layers, small children and the elderly probably suffered the most, because physics is a jerk, you know. In order to avoid the worst of the haze, some families attempted to deal with this by constructing elevated platforms or sleeping closer to the ground. Others just trudged on, eyes watering as they stirred stew, or stumbled over a goat that was only partially cooked while trying to reach their bed. Some of the most expensive Viking houses had real smoke spouts in the roof. However, smoke was simply a part of the atmosphere for the typical Norse family. Every day it reminded you that fire was a friend and a burning health risk, warmed you and seasoned your meals, and you froze your toes off by opening a door and letting in fresh air if it became too smoky. The Vikings used an old and very useful survival trick when the sun decided to take a month off during the darkest days of the year: festivity. If you are too busy drinking and shouting around a bonfire, You will not freeze to death. Here comes Yule, the midwinter celebration that was equal parts religious observance, survival strategy, and justification for consuming whatever that wasn't strictly forbidden. Typically, it started around the winter solstice and lasted for days or even weeks, depending on how plentiful the supply of mead was. This was a psychological life raft, not just a party. When morale was scuffing the frost-covered floor, Yule cheered everyone up. In addition to preventing death, it offered individuals something to look forward to. Families got together, animals were slaughtered for food and blessings, and huge fires were started to represent the sun's return. These were roaring infernos that almost dared the night to approach, not charming tiny flames. They played games, drank mead and ale, ate preserved meat, told sagas, and occasionally, just occasionally, sang, not in a courteous manner either. Viking singing likely sounded like a battle cry being used to entice a thunderstorm. Originally a real log that burned for days, the Yule log is today a charming treat or ornamental centerpiece. It was meant to stand for continuity, warmth, and keeping your family comfortable. Very Viking, both symbolic and practical. Supernatural issues were also present. It was believed that trolls, spirits, and restless ancestors roamed freely during the winter. In order to maintain harmony and perhaps deter those spirits from stealing your goat, ceremonies, charms, and offerings were created. Indeed, Yule is the source of many contemporary Christmas customs. Norse-approved activities included hauling dead trees within, eating, offering gifts, and evergreens. Yule was more about perseverance than anything else, with fire, food, and a resolute confidence that the cold will pass. The Vikings fashioned joy from scratch in a world without light switches, vitamin D supplements, or an understanding of seasonal sadness, since it did every time. When didn't it? At least you had a full stomach and a tale worth telling when you left. Gold was good in Viking Age Scandinavia. Silver was superior. Wool, though? Life was wool. Wool was more than just a substance. Second only to fire and the rare sheep hug, it was a Viking's main defense against the cold. It was layered into everything, spun, weaved and stitched. Blankets, mittens, stockings, tunics, cloaks and undergarments. It was made of wool if that was possible. The explanation was straightforward. Wool is effective. Wool keeps heat even when wet, in contrast to cotton, which sticks to you like a cold, wet betrayal. That's helpful when the local weather prediction calls for cold fog and a healthy dose of remorse. Sheep were raised in every home, particularly on remote farms, for the wonderful, itchy miracle that is sprouting on their backs, not for their cuteness or cheese. Wool spinning was a year-round occupation that was mostly performed by women and children. It was the closest thing to heating the future throughout the cold. Although the Vikings weren't fashionistas, their woolen clothing was surprisingly well-tailored. They fitted tunics. Cloaks were sliced to make room for movement. Leg wraps were skillfully wrapped so you wouldn't trip in the middle of a snowstorm. Warmth came after form and function after form. Actually, your wool's quality revealed a lot about you. Wearing coarse wool was a sign of practicality or poverty. Tightly woven soft wool, it was a luxury. The Viking version of a cashmere sweatshirt. Rich Vikings could afford wool that had been dyed, sometimes even imported colors like red or blue. 37 hues of sheep were worn by everyone else. Additionally, remember felt, a windproof mat made of wool that had been drenched, trampled, and mistreated until it fused. Felt was used by Vikings for mittens, boots, hats, and sometimes to insulate walls. It was effective, but it was like weaving cloth out of anger and perspiration. Clothing made of wool was repaired, patched, and handed down. There was no waste. Even leftover wool was rewoven into stuffing or socks. Assuming it didn't burn, blow away, or end up buried with you as part of your farewell attire, a quality cloak may endure for generations. Although it may seem contradictory, some fans intentionally make themselves colder. Indeed, saunas and ice baths were popular among the Vikings because they believed that facing the cold head-on was preferable to just surviving it. Badstoffer, or Viking sweat lodges, were little pits or shelters made of stone and grass where steam was created by dousing heated stones with water. The outside world would freeze solid while you sat inside, half naked and sweating profusely like a madman at a summer feast. It was a smoky, steamy, and muggy respite from the icy world outside the door. Then, and this is where the real fun begins, some Vikings would intentionally run outside and roll in the snow or dive into icy water for health reasons, or more accurately, because they wanted to demonstrate to the gods, themselves, and anybody else, observing that they had no fears whatsoever, not even of cold. These hot-cold customs served a useful purpose rather than being purely showy. Sweating cleansed the body, or at least gave you the impression that you were taking a bath after going weeks without taking one. Additionally, the drastic temperature changes improved circulation, unclogged sinuses, and momentarily erased the memory of a world devoid of medications and insulation. They served a social purpose as well. Families or groups would sweat and freeze together in community saunas, sometimes as part of rituals, and other times just to connect while gradually steaming their sorrows. Naturally, steam rooms also served as temporary hospitals, healing areas, and delivery rooms. Vikings almost often said, "Let's cook it first, then freeze it for good measure," when something needed to be fixed, heated, or flushed out. These customs persisted because they worked so well. Although they tend to exclude goats from sauna culture these days, modern Nordic nations still practice it. It was one thing to survive the cold. It was a form of battle in and of itself to survive the monotony. In the face of long, dark nights, frozen land, and months without the ability to farm, sail, or raid, Vikings had to find inventive ways to kill their family members or lose their minds while they were home. Repairs and preparations come first. Winter was the best season for repairing tools, restring bows, mending clothing, and sharpening swords. Unless you liked frostbite in novel ways, you'd best believe that if you had a hole in October, it was mended by candlelight in December. Then came weaving and spinning. Countless hours were spent spinning wool into yarn and yarn into clothing by women, kids, and anybody else with two working hands. You knew your cloak didn't make itself, but it wasn't glamorous. Each stitch was an additional barrier between you and wind-chill death. Crafting was also involved: antler combs, bone tools, and wood carvings. Practicality gave way to art in the winter. Despite its gloomy exterior, the longhouse was a hive of silent production, and the occasional curse when someone dropped a needle. The main one was telling stories. While the Vikings had sagas, they lacked Netflix. Epic oral stories about monsters, gods, heroes, and other family members who made bad decisions in life. Each repeating of these tales, which were transmitted by firelight, was somewhat enhanced for dramatic effect. The giant wasn't simply killed by Thor, then he probably punched the moon. Games also helped. The Vikings played dice games that mixed luck, bluffing, and maybe a little gambling, as well as board games like Hane-Fatafel, a strategy game that makes chess appear like tic-tac-toe. When things were truly boring, some families also performed simulated dueling or played riddles. Alcohol lubricated all of this, of course. Mead gave observers a little more amusement from family arguments, sloppier crafting, and funnier storytelling. The Vikings used more than just fires, cloaks, and a dubious connection with livestock to combat the cold. They used mentality to combat it. And not the kind of motivational billboard, rather, it's more akin to a deep-seated denial that nature is attempting to kill them. Winter was neither surprising nor terrible to the typical Norse. Like planting season or the time to launch another raid on France, it was just a part of the calendar. Winter was not dreaded by them. They anticipated it, prepared for it, and shrugged their shoulders in response. It wasn't a coincidence. From birth, Vikings were taught to view adversity as a test rather than a problem. Chilly, pain, hunger. Failure wasn't what that was. Character growth was what that was. You didn't voice any complaints, you persevered. Ideally, this attitude wasn't merely cultural, with a stoic scowl and perhaps a snarky remark about how this was still preferable to handling taxes. It had a spiritual quality. Frost giants, long winters, and gods who breeze through agony like it's a Tuesday are all commonplace in Norse mythology. You cease cringing at a little snow when your belief system incorporates an actual apocalypse known as Thimblewinter, an all-consuming, never-ending freezing before the end of the world. Social reinforcement was given to this mental toughness. It wasn't exactly a mockery of weakness, they just ignored it. Nobody wished to be the one who was unable to cope with the darkness. So they continued. They remained occupied. They made light of the cold. They poured another mug of mead and continued making their 43rd mitten after laughing in the face of despair. Early toughness training was even taught to kids. You used your elbows if your fingers were cold. Walk more quickly if your toes were numb. Congratulations if you survived a fall through ice. You were now worthy of being the subject of stories. Was it wholesome? Most likely not. Successful? Of course. The significance of mentality is discussed in contemporary survival manuals. The Vikings were aware already. They did not consider cold to be an adversary to be vanquished. They viewed it as an exam that they had already successfully completed 100 times, and so they made it through the coldest nights. Fur, fire, and a middle finger to the wind in a psychological sense. This was something that the Vikings knew better than most others. No one makes it through the winter alone. The sturdiest longhouse, the fattest goat, and the warmest robe are all yours. You're just a chilly individual with fancy things if you don't have a sense of community. Interdependence was the foundation of Viking culture. Families did not live apart. Usually composed of close associates and extended family, they gathered in farms, villages, or settlements. This network literally saved your life when winter arrived. They exchanged food, they pooled their firewood, someone assisted you in fixing your roof if it collapsed. Someone gave prayers, herbs, or at least a sympathetic grunt if your child became ill. This was not an act of kindness for the sake of being kind. It was math for survival. You would have more hands come springtime if you could keep more people alive through the winter for warfare, farming, sailing, or simply keeping the cows back when it's time to calve. Even if it meant sharing your last smoked salmon with a cousin you didn't particularly like, helping others benefited you. This relationship was strengthened by food, storytelling, and low-grade inebriated philosophy during midwinter feasts such as Yule. These weren't merely gatherings. They served as social glue, preserving spirits and letting everyone know they weren't alone in the dark. This attitude was reflected in resource storage as well. Smokehouses, meat vaults, and communal granaries were commonplace. Other families helped out when one family's supplies ran low. The length of winter meant that one weak link in the chain could bring the entire gang down, not because it was courteous. Leadership and justice also played a part. In addition to keeping the peace, local chieftains, sometimes known as godi priests, and legal authorities were in charge of ensuring that nobody got stuck in a ditch. Their ability to handle logistics and the law was what made them reputable. A recognized leader was able to arrange the gathering of firewood and resolve conflicts. Peer pressure was another factor, of course. Your neighbors would notice if you attempted to hoard food or neglect your responsibilities, and in Viking culture, being scrutinized by the entire town was only somewhat worse than dying. One truth remained in the midst of everything: the snow, the darkness, the snoring of the livestock in your bed. The Vikings were more than just cold survivors. It became a testing ground for them. Every layer of wool, smoke puff, and grim joke around the fireplace was a part of a cultural framework that had a single goal in mind: endurance. Winter was no hindrance. It was an adversary. What about the Vikings? They prepared for the game all year long. They were always adapting. They covered the longhouse with moss if it was too draughty. They added turnip to make the stew thicker if it was thin. They spent the weeks that the nights dragged on with games, stories, rituals, and the odd spontaneous cousin wrestling bout. No central heating, all right. They constructed fire pits, no waterproof equipment. They made it up out of obstinacy and sheep, not a single antidepressant. They had mead, sagas, and the sort of gloomy humor that makes the arrival of seasonal depression dreadful. Additionally, the Vikings used the winter to strengthen themselves while other civilizations slowed down. Weapons were fixed, youngsters received training. Around the fire, fresh concepts were developed. These people didn't stutter and blink into the sun when the ice thawed. They were prepared, all set to cultivate crops, construct ships, form coalitions, or traverse oceans to destinations that are warmer, wealthier, or just plain deserving of pillage. They were not weakened by winter. They became hard as a result, made them more creative, meaner, and leaner. Their prosperity was not due to supernatural protection or wizardry. It resulted from an unrelenting, frequently smoky will to live by any means required. They steamed in a hut, slept beneath a goat, or consumed yogurt that also served as industrial sealant. Together, they accomplished it. On February 12, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born in a one-room log cabin on the outskirts of the Kentucky wilderness, a place where education was considered an afterthought and survival was never certain. Thomas Lincoln, his father, was a diligent farmer and carpenter who lacked formal education. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, his mother, was calm, kind, and well-read, an uncommon sight on the frontier. They all struggled to make ends meet while living in near destitution in thick forests and thin land. The cabin itself lacked a floor, windows, and most definitely bookshelves. For a large portion of his early years, Abraham lived in a world of candlelight, quiet, and never-ending work. Growing up, he would carry water, cut wood, and wear clothing that was more patchwork than fabric. During those early years, formal education did not exist. Lincoln would subsequently calculate that he received less than a year of formal schooling throughout his lifetime. But he had a restless intellect, a burning desire to study, and something more potent. Abraham was just 9 years old in 1818 when Nancy Hanks passed away, possibly from milk sickness. The boy's existence would never fully fill the gap she left behind. She had been the one who recognized a change in him and served as his emotional fulcrum. Young Abe carved a wooden memorial himself after her burial, which was carried out by hand in the forest behind their farm. It was smeared with tears and was rough and crude. However, it spoke for itself. He recalled her. Thomas remarried Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow, a few months later. Sarah provided order, books, and comfort, in contrast to the traditional evil stepmother. She nurtured Lincoln's interest and acknowledged his intelligence. He consumed anything he could lay his hands on, including the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, and Aesop's tales in between duties. He would use charcoal to write his own ideas on wooden shingles if he was unable to obtain a book. This youngster was already creating something inside of himself. He was bone-thin, barefoot, and had a countenance too serious for his age. He had received little from the world, no money, no contacts, no comfort. Abraham Lincoln, however, started the long, unlikely journey to greatness in that small cabin in the Kentucky woods because he had a fire within of him that would not go out. Life on the frontier didn't get any easier when Lincoln entered his adolescence. It hardened, if anything. His family relocated once more, this time to Indiana's thick, marshy woods, clearing trees, plows, and enduring harsh winters with little more than a hearth fire and hope meant that every day was a struggle against the weather. Though the country and the axe shaped his physique, his mind stayed in a completely other place. Although he was incredibly powerful, his towering height and odd reading habit during his free time were what made him famous among his neighbors. He would sit beneath trees and jot down ideas on the edges of whatever scrap paper he could find, carry books with him when he went on walks, and memorize Shakespeare while mowing fences. His wry, perceptive, and frequently self-deprecating humor also started to emerge. The gangly teenager who quoted Jefferson while others exchanged hunting tales, he was the odd one out. Lincoln was a socially uncomfortable person. He was quiet but gregarious, eccentric but captivating. People paid attention when he spoke. They had no choice. He spoke in a straightforward, forceful, and occasionally humorous manner, always aiming for the truth. Even at that time, his moral compass was pointing straight ahead. He detested brutality. Slavery was something he detested. He also detested the way both were justified by ignorance. Lincoln had little formal schooling, yet he started to become passionate about the law. He was captivated by the notion that words, not fists, could win battles. He trained himself in logical argumentation and clear writing. He read every law book he could lay his hands on. Others may be gambling or drinking at night. Lincoln would be reading Blackstone's remarks by candlelight in a dimly lit room. He permanently left home by his early 20s. He saw firsthand the atrocities of the slave trade in New Orleans while working as a flatboatman on the Mississippi River. He would carry those pictures with him, burning them into his mind. After his return, he settled in New Salem, Illinois, and started a new life. Through pure willpower, he joined the local debate organization, taught himself language, and started the arduous journey to become a lawyer. He had no degree, diploma, or family history, just the conviction that knowledge was power that could be shaped, like everything else in his life, with hard work, foresight, and a little suffering. Abraham Lincoln was already a legend in central Illinois by the time he became a lawyer, not because of his status, but rather because of his presence. He wasn't the type of man who entered a room and used flashy attire or well-polished charm to command attention. His coat was ill-fitting, his pants were too short, and he was frequently disheveled. But many leaned in as he got up to talk. His candor, honesty, and relatability were more valuable than fashion. Lincoln had a unique legal career. He never went to law school. He used self-study to pass the bar test and read law books that kind lawyers loaned him. After being accepted, he rode a horse through the extensive network of rural courts that made up the 8th Judicial Circuit, often for weeks at a time. In the spring, the roads were mud, in the summer they were dust, and in the winter they were ice. He slept under the stars, in log homes and in bars. However, he adored it. It wasn't just his reasoning that made Lincoln stand out in court. He was empathetic. A polished lawyer could never relate to jurors the way he could. He would be straightforward in his speech, tell evocative tales, and show respect to even the poorest widow or the smallest farmer. "He makes you feel like he's one of us, not above us," one farmer added. That was the reality. Lincoln always remembered his origins and never feigned to be someone he wasn't. He wasn't soft, though. He was unrelenting in court when he felt that a case was important. Even though he occasionally spoke slowly and awkwardly, his speeches gained momentum. He would repeatedly lay out facts until the other side collapsed under the weight of his own inconsistencies. He laid soft traps with his cross-examinations. After lulling witnesses into complacency, he would pose a question that would undermine their testimony. Lincoln earned the nickname Honest Abe over time. It was not a catchphrase for a campaign, it was merited. If he believed a case was unfair, he returned fees. He wouldn't take on clients who lied, and he just left when other attorneys took shortcuts. He became known as a lawyer who knew the land and the law. However, another fire was simmering behind the scenes: politics. He had learned how people worked from the law. He now desired to contribute to the reform of the system in which they lived. Lincoln's silent conscience was on the verge of exploding as slavery began to gain more and more attention in the public discourse. Lincoln didn't have a particularly successful first journey into politics. He was only 23 when he ran unsuccessfully for the Illinois state legislature in 1832. Failure, however, did not deter him. It explained what he had to do, if anything: learn more, meet people where they are, and listen more. He made another attempt and succeeded 2 years later. Lincoln immediately established a reputation for his measured remarks, sardonic humor, and moral conviction in Springfield, the new capital. He didn't yell, he didn't plot. However, many recalled it when he spoke up at the State House. Cheap wins and gaudy slogans didn't appeal to him. He had a more profound objective: recognizing the workings of justice, society, and the law. Lincoln joined the Whig Party, which supported infrastructure development, modernization, and restraint of the executive branch. However, he was still wary of ambition while being a Whig. He frequently made fun of the fact that he was too unattractive for politics. He debated passionately and studied a great deal, but he never seemed to have the same desire for power as other men. Politics, if anything, appeared to be a burden he accepted rather than sought. Lincoln formed partnerships with farmers, businessmen, and other attorneys during his 4 terms in the Illinois legislature. Although he wasn't the loudest, he was frequently the most reliable. He gained a reputation for having moral convictions, particularly in regard to slavery. He was adamantly against the spread of slavery into other areas, even if he wasn't yet advocating for its outlawing. He referred to it as a national hypocrisy, unjust and immoral. Lincoln entered national politics in 1846 and was elected to the U.S. Representatives House. There, he boldly and unpopularly opposed the Mexican-American War, claiming it was unnecessary and unlawful. Politically, this was a poor choice. It was unpopular in his district. He didn't run for office again after serving 1 term. He resumed practicing law in Springfield, married Mary Todd, a learned woman from a family that owned slaves in Kentucky, and made an effort to lead a more sedate life. However, the country was undergoing fast change. The nation was being torn apart by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, and the spread of slavery. Lincoln had quit politics, but he had not left politics. The arguments were becoming more heated and violent. The previously cautious man was ready to rise, not as a contender but as a conscience. As the Union started to fall apart, the slavery debate had subsided by the 1850s. It boiled. Intense bloodshed and greater separation were sparked by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which gave new territories the autonomy to determine whether or not to allow slavery. Bleeding Kansas came to represent turmoil on a national scale. It was a watershed moment for Abraham Lincoln. He was unable to remain silent any longer. He returned to politics with moral earnestness rather than bluster. He became a member of the newly established Republican Party, which was made up of abolitionists, free soilers, and former Whigs who were all opposed to the spread of slavery. Lincoln was not a fervent opponent of slavery. Although he did not yet advocate for immediate liberation, he was adamant that slavery was wrong and that it was hazardous and unfair to allow it to extend into new states. He shot to national prominence in 1858 when he ran for the Senate against one of America's most well-known politicians, Stephen A. Douglas. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, one of the most well-known political contests in American history, began when the two agreed to a series of debates throughout Illinois. Douglas supported the notion of popular sovereignty, which holds that each state should decide whether or not to permit slavery. Lincoln answered clearly. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. Slavery would destroy the Union if it spread farther." He maintained that the country could not continue to be half free and half slave. Although he lost the Senate campaign, he gained more notoriety across the country. His words were repeated nationwide in newspapers. The lanky Illinois lawyer with the deep-set eyes and deeper convictions was suddenly spoken about by people who had never heard of Lincoln before. He had shown himself even though he had lost. He never faltered as he faced off against one of the greatest orators of his era. His conscience compelled him to question the country's comfort, not for his own benefit. Lincoln struggled in private with the magnitude of the problem. He once stated that nothing is bad if slavery isn't. However, he was also aware that a hasty decision could destroy the delicate union. The dice was cast, however. Lincoln was rising in tandem with the changing national mood, not as a politician offering simple solutions, but rather as a moral voice in a morally hazy era. America was on the precipice by 1860. Tensions between the various sections had gotten out of hand. Slavery was no longer solely a moral issue. A political conflagration ensued. The Republican Party was searching for a leader who could bring the North together without starting a war right once, while Southern states threatened to secede. Abraham Lincoln was that improbable individual. He was not the front-runner at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. In actuality, the majority anticipated that New York Senator William Seward, a skilled statesman with decades of political experience, would receive the nomination. Lincoln, however, had a clean record, a reasonable demeanor, and strong momentum from his debates with Douglas that the others lacked. Behind the scenes, his staff worked hard to highlight his frontier heritage and integrity. Lincoln was presented as the self-made man who emerged from nothing, the rail splitter. His modest upbringing wasn't a drawback. They represented the promise of America. He won the nomination by the third ballot. The political community blinked in shock. The general election was acrimonious and polarizing. Northern and southern parts of the Democratic Party supported opposing candidates, causing the party to split in two. Most southern ballots did not even include Lincoln's name. However, he had a great deal of support in the North and West. With only 40% of the popular vote, but a resounding electoral majority, he was elected the 16th President of the United States on November 6, 1860. He did not rejoice. The atmosphere was actually gloomy. South Carolina voted to secede in a matter of weeks. Before Lincoln even took office, 6 more southern states joined. The nation was disintegrating more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Lincoln was getting death threats every day as he got ready to leave Springfield for his inauguration in Washington, D.C. He wouldn't make it through the trip, some said. Because of the strict security, he had to enter the capital by rail at night while disguised and without warning. This was no conqueror's victorious arrival. The Union had been shattered by the hesitant arrival of a president-elect. Lincoln stepped into office on March 4, 1861, to find a divided, irate, and armed nation. Nevertheless, he aimed for peace rather than retribution in his speech. "We are friends, not enemies," he remarked. "We can't be adversaries." At the door, however, the winds of battle were already howling. Fort Sumter in South Carolina was the site of the first shots fired barely a month after Abraham Lincoln assumed office. The Civil War was underway. The ensuing struggle was the deadliest in American history and a cruel test of Lincoln's character, leadership, and resolve, in addition to his military prowess. Lincoln had never served in the military. Although he had been a captain for a short time during the Black Hawk War, he had never been in battle. He was now in charge of a country at war with itself. He read telegrams, studied maps, and picked up tactics on the spot while spending long nights in the War Department. He questioned his generals, read literature on warfare, and became fixated on troop movements. He wasn't naturally a warrior, but he had to learn to be one. Frustration characterized his early presidency. He was let down by general after general. The fight was especially devoted to George McClellan. Exasperated by excuses and delays, Lincoln once said, "I would like to borrow the army for a while if General McClellan does not want to use it." Lincoln's true brilliance, however, extended beyond his choices on the battlefield. It was a vision. He saw that states' rights and independence were not the only issues at stake in this conflict. It was about the country's basic soul. Could a nation founded on freedom endure being partially enslaved? Lincoln first took a cautious approach to slavery out of concern that border states would join the Confederacy as a result of harsh abolition. However, his perspective changed as the conflict continued and the number of victims increased. It became impossible to separate the military question from the moral one. He came to the conclusion that the Confederate economy and morale were driven by slavery. The insurrection wouldn't end till it was annihilated. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, stating that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were now free. It revolutionized everything, but it didn't instantly free everyone. The battle to keep the Union intact was no longer the exclusive goal of the war. Human freedom was at stake. It prevented France or Britain from supporting the Confederacy on a global scale. On the home front, it provided black men with the morale and rationale to enlist in the Union Army, which thousands did, in defense of a nation that had long refused them citizenship. Lincoln had changed from the lawyer in the log cabin to a wartime president with moral clout in addition to power. Lincoln, thinner, grayer, and obviously older, carried the load alone at the top as the war continued into its fourth year. There were new casualty lists every day. Towns turned into cemeteries. Grieving wives and mothers wrote to him, asking to know why their husbands and sons had passed away. Lincoln carried the war on his shoulders and in his eyes, despite the fact that he never saw combat. His cabinet was made up of a variety of guys who had previously opposed him and were not always respectful of him. Lincoln, however, balanced ambition and purpose, handling them like a maestro. He ruled without coercion or terror. He reigned clearly, patiently, and with stories. Even his detractors started to acknowledge that beneath the smile was steel. Next followed the Battle of Gettysburg. The July 1863 fight marked a sea change. In 3 days of misery, more than 50,000 soldiers were killed, injured, or reported missing. Lincoln visited Pennsylvania a few months later to give a brief address at the newly constructed cemetery. It was only intended to be a few words of thought, not to make headlines. However, he recast the war's goal in just 272 words, that this country will experience a new era of freedom under God, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people will continue to exist. It was hardly a grandiose Gettysburg address. It was solemn, reserved, and timeless. It also demonstrated that unity was not the only goal of this conflict. Redeeming the country and turning it into what it had always purported to be was the goal. Lincoln encountered strong resistance as the 1864 presidential election approached. His support was eroding, and the conflict was still going on. There were calls to replace him on the ticket even within his own party. Many thought he would lose to the very general he had fired, George McClellan, a Democrat. However, momentum shifted back in Lincoln's favor as Union successes grew in the latter part of that year, particularly General Sherman's conquest of Atlanta. Whither he said he was re-elected. Lincoln recognized that peace would be more difficult, but the war was almost won. Muskets may be used to rebuild the Union. But the soul of the country, that would require a lot more work, healing, vision, and mercy. The Confederacy began to fall apart in early 1865. Cities collapsed one after another. The Confederate capital, Richmond, was on fire. General Robert E. Lee's army was running out of supplies, soldiers, and time. Lincoln, however, was not happy. For him, winning was never about getting in trouble. It was about restoration. Lincoln talked as a moral philosopher rather than a conqueror in his second inauguration address, which was given on March 4, 1865. He said, "Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, with charity for everyone, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, and with no malice toward anyone." A politician who wanted to destroy his rivals did not say these things. They came from a parent attempting to mend his shattered family. Lee turned himself up to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. The conflict was over. The Union had been preserved. With the enactment of the 13th Amendment, slavery was outlawed. The country took a shaky stride toward the principles it had declared in 1776 for the first time in ages, but catastrophe came as the nation was about to breathe. Abraham Lincoln saw a play at Ford's Theater in Washington just 5 days after the surrender. John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, sneaked into the presidential box during the play and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The following morning, April 15, 1865, he passed away. More than ever, the country was in mourning. Many recently released Black Americans sobbed in the streets. Even in the South, former adversaries recognized the magnitude of the loss. He had been their best chance for reconciliation, a guy who never saw politics as war and never let hatred take root in his heart. Lincoln did not live to see the wounds his presidency had helped reveal healed or to witness reconstruction. However, his passing changed him from a leader to a representation of liberty, solidarity, and the agonizing cost of moral advancement. Abraham Lincoln rose without wealth, privilege, or brutality from the dirt floor of a cabin in Kentucky to the nation's highest office. He led a nation through its darkest hour, not with blinding brilliance, but with steady, unwavering illumination. And in the history of America, that light, dimmed by an assassin's bullet, continues to burn. We typically picture magnificent empires, glistening temples, and dramatic conflicts when we think of the ancient world. How these individuals poop is something we hardly ever think about. However, daily life was molded as much by sanitation, or the absence of it, as by any monarchy or conflict. Every clay brick house or marble palace had a mess that someone had to clean up, and it was a much more public and odorous affair than we care to acknowledge, especially in an era without flush buttons or scented sprays. In the past, toilets served purposes beyond simple comfort. They have to do with surviving. Disease is carried by human waste, and entire communities suffered when it was not properly managed, as it frequently did. Invisible killers like parasitic diseases, cholera, and dysentery were common. Waste clung on sandals, poured into wells, and flowed through the streets of unsanitary cities. In locations that prioritized sanitation, however, something extraordinary occurred. Urban centers thrived, epidemics decreased, and life expectancy increased. It may surprise you to learn that some of the oldest civilizations in history created systems that don't seem completely out of place now. Brick restrooms and street-wide drainage were features of the cities in the Indus Valley. The Minoans constructed flushing systems and ceramic pipes. Waste management was nearly made into an art form by the Romans. Even though some societies, such as the Vikings or the early Chinese dynasties, took a somewhat more rustic approach, their practices nonetheless mirrored cultural beliefs about modesty, health, and the environment. Let's be clear, though. In the past, restrooms were not always unclean, private, or dignified. Particularly in metropolitan areas or military barracks, communal restrooms were frequently the standard. Imagine 20 stone holes in a row with no partitions between them. Everyone would be sitting elbow to elbow, chatting or squabbling. As they went about their daily business, they passed around sticks of sponge. Water wasn't always utilized for flushing, but for rinsing. And literally underneath it all were the first sewers, cesspits, and occasionally just open ditches. A society's principles were reflected in its level of cleanliness. Where it was ignored, mayhem ensued. Culture flourished where it was designed. Additionally, if you have the courage to see past the squalor, you will uncover a hidden past where poop, pits, and pipes reveal more about old life than monuments ever could. The people of the Indus Valley were already resolving one of the dirtiest issues facing civilization even before the Romans installed aqueducts or the Greeks envisioned public baths. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, which date to approximately 2600 BCE and are situated in present-day Pakistan, were remarkably sophisticated in terms of urban design, especially with regard to the handling of human waste. The remnants of these ancient towns may initially appear to be nothing more than dusty ruins, but look deeper and you'll see a highly ordered network of brick-lined roadways with regulated measurements and, most impressively, covered drainage systems running alongside them. Yes, the Indus people had worked out how to keep their cities running smoothly and their homes clean, while most of the rest of the globe was still digging holes in the earth. Every home, even the smallest ones, had a little space for washing, which was frequently equipped with a vertical chute and a squat toilet or bathing area. Waste was directed by this chute into an outdoor covered brick drain, which connected to bigger public sewers. These ditches were hardly primitive. They were designed with brick baffles to capture solids, gradients, and inspection holes. According to some academics, waste from affluent households was flushed with water jars, with gravity taking care of the rest. Toilets weren't the only thing the genius thought of. Stormwater and waste were also segregated by the Indus system. The streets were lined with public wells. The very existence of sanitation infrastructure suggests a strong care for public health, which is uncommon for its time, even though we cannot be certain how water safety was guaranteed. The absence of palaces or temples in ancient cities is possibly the most striking feature of all. It seems that equality and urban function were more important to the Indus people than ecclesiastical structures, and that's reflected in their toilet systems, widespread, democratic, and surprisingly practical. Unfortunately, a lot of information regarding the Indus civilization is still unknown. We have yet to comprehend their writing system, and we are unsure of the precise causes of their city eventual downfall. However, the silent brick tubes buried beneath their feet, their toilets, continue to speak loudly. The Indus opted for something more subdued, hygienic, and possibly even more civilized in an era when many empires ruled by spectacle. The ancient Egyptians had a different perspective on cleanliness than the Indus Valley, which designed underground sewers. One entrenched in tradition, prestige, and a strong conviction in the virtues of bodily and spiritual purity. They saw hygiene as more than merely preventing illness. It was a kind of devotion. Bathing was a necessary daily ritual in ancient Egypt, a culture supplied by the Nile, particularly for the wealthy. Small limestone basins or bathing chambers were common in affluent homes where staff would pour water for washing. Hair removal was commonplace, and natron, a natural salt, oils, and scented ointments were frequently employed. However, things became a bit more problematic when it came to restrooms. Sensible. Ancient Egyptian toilets ranged from basic sand-lined pits to more elaborate seats made of limestone or wood that were set over ceramic pots. Slaves or servants would empty these pots and dump them far from habitations, preferably in the desert. These seats may be hidden away in private areas of richer homes, suggesting the rising correlation between status and cleanliness. However, public sanitation was essentially non-existent. While trash was occasionally used as fertilizer in rural regions, it wasn't always handled properly in urban areas, and streets in places like Memphis or Thebes were frequently filthy. Rather, personal hygiene continued to be the main priority. For instance, priests had to shave their bodies, take several daily baths, and abstain from pollutants. Without ritual cleaning, which occasionally involved enemas, not for medical purposes, but rather as a spiritual prelude, they were not allowed to enter temples. It's interesting to note that toilet stools were sometimes found among the grave goods of pharaohs and aristocrats. It appears that the ancient Egyptians anticipated that one would still need to conduct oneself with respect after death. Early attempts at insect control were also attempted by the Egyptians. Flies and other disease-carrying insects were repelled by amulets, spells, and ointments. Cleanliness thus hovered between the material and the spiritual. In summary, Egypt pioneered a cultural emphasis on hygiene, even if it did not build extensive sewer infrastructure. Their fixation on purity had an impact on daily life, religion, and medicine. They may have had basic toilets, but their concepts of hygiene were far from straightforward. While much of Bronze Age Europe was crouching over pits, the Minoans of Crete were flushing. Yes, more than 300-500 years ago, flushing. The most advanced plumbing system in Antiquity was created by the Minoan civilization, which flourished from about 2000 to 1400 BCE. Labyrinth stories and frescoes were not the only things found in their capital at Knossos. It also had multi-story structures with functional restrooms and running water. The Minoans were the first to understand gravity and water pressure, concepts that many other civilizations would not grasp for decades. Terracotta pipes were installed inside the walls and under the floors of their palaces, directing spring and rainwater into spas, fountains, and, most famously, latrines. Archaeologists found what may be the oldest flush toilet ever uncovered in the Queen's Megaron of Knossos. It was a wooden seat over a stone basin that was connected to a vertical conduit that allowed water to be manually poured from a vessel to flush the toilet. Taking a bath was also very important. Large ceramic bathtubs that resemble those found in contemporary homes were built by the Minoans. Aqueducts or rooftop tanks might supply water, and subterranean routes could drain it. Although this is still up for debate, it has even been suggested that U-shaped water traps, which are a forerunner to the contemporary plumbing trap, be used to block odors. The incorporation of these systems into affluent residences is especially remarkable, implying that cleanliness and comfort were indicators of status. Minoan sanitation was more private than later Roman latrines, which were communal and open to the public. Even many Europeans in the 19th century did not have the pleasure of having a toilet in their own homes. The Minoans were not just pragmatic, they were also fashionable. Beautiful plasterwork and vibrant frescoes adorned their bathrooms. It appears that sanitation could be both practical and stylish. Unfortunately, the demise of the Minoan civilization around 1450 BCE, probably owing to volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, or invasions, led to the loss of these innovations. Similar toilet technology would not reappear in other Mediterranean regions for more than a millennium. Nevertheless, the remains of Knossos reveal a straightforward reality. Cleanliness, trash removal, and private bathing are not contemporary obsessions. It is very human, ancient, and, in the case of the Minoans, remarkably sophisticated. The Romans made the biggest and boldest statement of any ancient culture when it came to sanitation. They had perfected the technique of building roads, aqueducts, and, yes, even toilets by the time the Roman Empire was at its height. For the Romans, sanitation was an integral part of civilization, not just a matter of hygiene. This required making restrooms accessible, effective, and, surprisingly, social. You can probably locate public latrines which are open spaces with long stone benches with holes uniformly spaced in any important Roman city, from Pompeii to Londinium. There are no barriers or stalls, only elbow-to-elbow seating. A continuous trickle of water ran beneath the seats to remove waste, while a secondary channel contained sponge sticks or tessoria, the Roman equivalent of toilet paper. These sponges were reused after being communally rinsed in water and vinegar. Clean? Not exactly. Operational? Very. Using the restroom was a social activity rather than a private one for the Romans. While attending to the call of nature, people engaged in conversation, gossip, and business dealings. Latrines were frequently embellished with inscriptions or mosaics, some of which were obscene or amusing. Graffiti in Pompeii's restrooms includes grievances about foul odors, subpar plumbing, and of course, impolite patrons. Toilets, however, were only one aspect of Roman cleanliness. Their towns were interspersed by massive sewer systems called cloaca, the most well-known of which was Rome's Cloaca Maxima. Originally constructed to empty wetlands, it served as the foundation for Rome's garbage disposal system. It was supplied with fresh water from miles distant by aqueducts which let rainwater, urine and feces to flow through it. Richer Romans used indoor latrines in their residences which flowed either straight into the sewers or into cesspits. Even though it was illegal, the impoverished relied on chamber pots which were occasionally thrown out of windows onto the street. The worst affected were those who lived in apartments, particularly in multi-story tenements and insulae. Many buildings had no plumbing at all and sewage frequently inundated the lower floors. Urine was interestingly taxed by the Romans. The urine fee that Emperor Vespasian imposed on public urinals was so notorious that his name is still connected to urinals in France and Italy today. To put it briefly, Roman toilets weren't simply sophisticated. They provided possibly the first widespread attempt at genuinely communal sanitation and were noisy, packed, politicized, and oddly progressive. The ancient Greeks adopted a more subdued stance, whereas the Romans welcomed public feces like a neighborhood picnic. They believed that personal bodily functions should be handled discreetly, silently, and ideally by one person only. They nevertheless made important contributions to cleanliness and sanitation, but in a totally different way. A clay pot or stone seat over a cesspit served as the basic toilet in the majority of Greek dwellings. Ordinary homes lacked sewer connections and flushing facilities. Typically, the excrement was gathered and manually deposited into pits or disposed of in isolated locations, frequently by slaves. Open drains were occasionally found in urban streets, but the stench increased with the size of cities. Although it wasn't always a top concern, sanitation was an issue. But bathing was a Greek obsession. Large public bathhouses were nearly always associated with gymnasia, where men worked out in their undies. These were used for more than merely wiping perspiration off. They served as important social hubs, gathering spots for networking, philosophical discussions, and civic education. Greek baths were more straightforward and frequently consisted of shallow pools, cold water basins, or circular tubs, in contrast to the lavish and marble-filled Roman baths. This bathing culture placed a high value on water control. To provide fresh water to cities like Athens, the Greeks constructed terracotta pipe systems, cisterns, and aqueducts. Indeed, one of the first known public latrines with stone seats and a drainage system was located in the Athenian agora. However, these were still uncommon. In contrast to Rome, Greek society never fully accepted the use of public restrooms. Theoretically, the Greeks made up for their lack of plumbing. The so-called founder of medicine, Hippocrates, was one of the first to associate health and cleanliness. He made the controversial claim that filth and contaminated water may spread illness. Roman city planning would eventually be influenced by his suggestions for dry houses, fresh water, and clean air. It's blatantly ironic. Even the civilization that brought us democracy and drama nevertheless favored keeping its most shady affairs private. For the Greeks, sanitation had nothing to do with infrastructure. Clean body, clean mind, and personal discipline were the main topics. Even though their latrines were unclean, their preoccupation with moral and physical purity served as a precursor to contemporary public health theory. In ancient China, maintaining cleanliness was seen as a representation of cosmic equilibrium as well as a human responsibility. Despite having less infrastructure than in the Indus Valley or Rome, sanitation was nevertheless ingrained in daily life through philosophies, traditions, and an incredibly extensive selection of toiletries. The majority of ancient Chinese dwellings lacked modern toilets. Chamber pots were the standard instead. Depending on one's rank, these transportable ceramic or bronze vessels came in a variety of sizes and designs ranging from functional to elaborate. The pots were either taken outside the city boundaries or emptied into larger cesspits in the home by family members or slaves after use. For centuries, some rural communities used human feces, also referred to as night soil, as fertilizer. There were public restrooms, particularly in bigger cities like Chang'an or Luoyang. These community spaces were frequently simple troughs or pits with wooden platforms for squatting or sitting. Remarkably, a few of these restrooms featured privacy screens, a feature uncommon in classical Rome. Typically, waste from these areas was gathered and repurposed for agricultural purposes, which, although effective, also presented concerns of pollution and illness. It's possible that toilet paper or something substantially similar originated in China. People were employing soft papers, which were frequently discarded writings, for personal hygiene as early as the 2nd century BCE. Researchers documented the usage of paper for post-defecation cleaning by the 6th century CE. The affluent favored bamboo spatulas or shreds of silk that were cleaned in between uses. Yes, it is what you read. One of the first reusable cleaning implements was a polished bamboo stick. Sanitation was spiritual as well as physical. Hygiene was associated with self-control and equilibrium, influenced by Taoist ideas of harmony and purity, as well as Confucian principles of order and respect. Despite being natural, excrement was viewed as a pollution that should be quickly removed and never brought up in polite conversation. This was taken a step further in imperial houses where garbage disposal was handled in total secrecy by specially selected eunuchs. Ancient China kept reasonably clean urban centers despite the absence of subterranean sewers because of careful human labor, cultural taboos, and a well-organized waste-collecting system. Although it wasn't glitzy, it was effective. The Chinese discovered a modest, effective, and firmly traditional approach to cleanliness through the use of chamber pots, composting, and paper wipes. The Vikings may not be the first group that springs to mind when considering historical cleanliness. Norse hygiene was more advanced and surprisingly strict than clichés indicate, despite their reputation for raids rather than regiments. Beneath the mythology of the horned helmet, there was a civilization that, despite its gruff exterior, took waste management and personal hygiene more seriously than most of medieval Europe. Latrine pits lined with stone or timber are simple, practical toilets used by both individuals and households in Viking communities, particularly in locations like Jorvik, modern-day York, England, and Hedeby in modern-day Germany. In order to offer seclusion and protection from the severe northern weather, these pits were occasionally covered with wooden shelters and were frequently excavated a short distance from residences. We can learn more about what the Vikings ate from the trash from these latrines, which is a mix of food leftovers, animal remnants, and human feces. It demonstrates that they had a centralized trash disposal system. These trenches were occasionally cleared out and repurposed in certain situations. In others, when the old trenches filled, new ones were just dug. Given that garbage will eventually gradually degrade and return to the soil, some evidence even supports the use of early composting techniques. Chamber pots and buckets were widespread within homes, particularly during lengthy freezing winters when it wasn't exactly optimal to venture outside. These were typically dumped into dung heaps or latrine pits close to a community's edge. Despite not being glitzy, it was more sensible and hygienic than dumping trash into the street, which was a frequent practice in certain medieval cities. However, hygiene was cultural as well as practical. The Vikings had frequent baths, generally once a week, on Lagdaga, which is the origin of the English name Saturday. Common items found in Norse archaeological sites include combs, ear cleaners, and tweezers, fashioned from bone or antler. Personal grooming was important for social standing and marriage possibilities, in addition to attractiveness. Viking sanitation was pragmatic in nature, but it lacked the Egyptian ritual cleanliness and the Roman architectural prowess. Although they didn't create toilet paper or sewers, they handled their waste, kept things tidy, and used practical, no-nonsense ways to adapt to a difficult environment. Even going about your daily business was conducted with the frank efficiency of a people who didn't have time for bother in the land of ice and iron. One fact endures over eras and civilizations. Without determining how to handle its garbage, no community could prosper. Humanity's relationship with sanitation has always walked a tightrope between necessity and neglect, as seen by the chamber pots of ancient China, the secret sewers of the Indus Valley, and the community latrines of Rome. It's remarkable how different societies valued cleanliness. Some made significant investments in infrastructure, such as the Minoans and Romans. They constructed sewage networks, flush systems, and aqueducts that, in certain situations, were on par with those of cities in the 19th century. Others, such as the Greeks and Chinese, associated cleanliness with ethics, health, and harmony with the natural world, placing it within the category of personal virtue. Others, such as the Vikings, adopted a tough yet realistic stance. Dig a hole, wash as soon as you can, and keep dirt away from your food. These communities were all striving to separate people from their garbage, despite their distinctions. There were other justifications, including maintaining public order, honoring the gods, and preventing illness. However, the result influenced how people perceived their bodies, how laws were established, and how cities expanded. Ironically, a lot of this age-old knowledge was lost in Europe during the Middle Ages. Following the collapse of Rome, advanced sanitation systems broke down, public restrooms vanished, sewers became clogged, and the rate of sickness increased. For urban designers to rediscover concepts that the ancients had previously grasped, centuries and numerous plagues would pass. Nevertheless, remnants of the ancient sanitary system can still be found today. The Latin latrina is where the word latrine originates. Minoan gravity systems are a distant ancestor of the flush toilet of today. The Chinese were the first to utilize paper in the restroom more than 1,000 years ago. In many instances, what feels contemporary has only recently been rediscovered. A silent foundation of civilization, sanitation is frequently disregarded in historical accounts. It does not inspire monuments or poetry. However, without it, populations suffer, cities fail, and empires may even fall. Remember that you are standing on the shoulders of generations who have tried, failed, and occasionally succeeded in figuring out how to keep the filth at bay the next time you enter a lavatory and enjoy the luxury of privacy, plumbing, and perhaps even scented soap. And that is possibly the greatest underappreciated accomplishment of civilization. Humans have an innate ability to map before the invention of satellites, compasses, or even writing. To make sense of their role in a large and frequently dangerous world, not only to document where things were. A map was more than just a depiction of the landscape. It was a survival guide, a belief system, and a story. It informed people of the whereabouts of the rivers, the sun's rise, the spirits' abodes, and the dangers that lurked just beyond the known. Not all of the oldest maps were created on paper or parchment. They were braided into oral memory, carved into stone, or scraped onto bone. More than 14,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic period, prehistoric engravings depicted animals, riverbanks, and groups of dwellings. Were they maps as we know them today? Not exactly. However, they made a basic beginning by capturing space in connection to movement and meaning. Maps became vital instruments of power as early cultures developed and trade routes grew. They led traders across deserts and mountains. They assisted monarchs in taxing their citizens and drawing borders. They even combined astronomy and theology in an attempt to explain the universe. It was an act of divine touch to trace the stars. Drawing a city meant bringing order to anarchy. However, accuracy wasn't always the goal of mapping. In actuality, by today's standards, ancient maps were frequently severely distorted, meaning not measurement was what counted. Whether it was Babylon, Jerusalem, or the island of Delos, the center of the universe was always home. Depending on their significance, lands either expanded or contracted. Unknown areas were inhabited by mythical creatures or merely marked, "Here be dragons." Flat maps weren't even used in some cultures. For example, Polynesian navigators made stick charts to record island swells and ocean currents, not for the sight, but for the hands and the brain. Unlike contemporary maps, these were intended to be felt and committed to memory through ritual training rather than read. Humans have an innate tendency to map and visualize time, space, and location. Maps, whether they were chanted in chants, painted on walls, or engraved in clay, allowed ancient people to establish connections with their gods, their surroundings, and one another. Finding their place in a mysterious and changing world was their constant objective, despite the vast differences in their approaches. The Babylonians started creating the earliest known maps out of clay in the midst of ancient Mesopotamia's temples and ziggurats, the birthplace of civilization. These were attempts to bring order to a chaotic environment by encapsulating everything in cuneiform lines and symbols. They were more than just useful instruments for land ownership or city planning. The Imago Mundi, a clay tablet from the 6th century BCE that is currently in the British Museum, is among the most well-known specimens. It is frequently referred to as the world's oldest map. It's a small window into the Babylonian world, measuring only 6 inches across. Babylon itself, depicted as a rectangle with a universe around it, sits at its center. Numerous cities, mountains, and areas are labeled in cuneiform, and the Euphrates River runs through the center. Beyond the planet lie enigmatic, triangular islands, each described in mythology, and a bitter river that is probably the ocean. These were metaphorical areas of peril and confusion, the boundaries of what was known, not actual locations. For the Babylonians, mapping was a spiritual as well as a geographic endeavor. Like the Earth, the skies were meticulously mapped. Using reed styluses, Babylonian astronomers meticulously recorded eclipses, lunar cycles, and planetary movements on clay tablets. In addition to being scientific, these celestial records were also utilized to discern the future and make ominous predictions. The sky chart served as a destiny guide. Land surveys were widespread and useful at a local level. As early as 2300 BCE, clay tablets document intricate agriculture plots, complete with ownership, irrigation canal, and boundary markers. Priests, tax collectors, and bureaucrats used these. Here, accuracy was crucial for controlling resources and wealth, rather than for navigating. An obsession with structure, both physical and metaphysical, is evident in Babylonian maps. With themselves at the center and encircled by rivers, adversaries, gods, and mysteries, they charted the universe as they perceived it. These maps were more than just documentation. They were statements of authority, belief, and a wish to shed some light on the unknown. The ancient Egyptians focused on something far more solid, the land itself, while the Babylonians charted the universe with cosmic rivers and mythological rings. Mapping was not abstract in the Nile floodplains. It was about survival, control, and the sacred geometry of an empire that spanned delta marshes and desert cliffs. World maps in the Babylonian sense were not created by the Egyptians. Rather, their mapping was really useful. Farmland divides and boundary markings were erased by the annual flooding of the Nile. Surveyors known as Harper Donapter redrew the grid using ropes, measuring rods, and sighting equipment in order to restore order. This was a yearly requirement rather than a one-time rite. Temple scribes and royal officials strictly regulated mapping as a governmental activity. Papyri that have survived display remarkably accurate maps. The Turin papyrus map, which dates to approximately 1160 BCE, is among the oldest known. It is a mining map, a precise arrangement of wadis, hills, and gold-bearing areas in the eastern desert. It is neither mythical nor ornamental. Distances and mineral kinds are marked by highways, streams, quarry sites, and hieratic script inscriptions. This was not a wall hanging in a palace, rather it was a functioning map for authorities and labor workers. However, symbolism was not completely absent from Egyptian maps. Cities were planned with cosmological order in mind, and temples were frequently constructed in accordance with heavenly events. The map represented Ma'at, the Egyptian idea of harmony and balance, and was more than just a tool. Urban design and land partition were based on holy ideas. Even tombs and pyramids had precise astronomical and mathematical orientations. Conceptual maps of the underworld, like those found in the Book of the Dead or the Amduat, are also found in religious writings. These spiritual maps showed the soul's passage through the 12 hours of the night, protected by gates, gods, and serpents. They led the dead through the landscape of forever, but they were cartographic in spirit rather than navigational. Back then, Egyptian mapping was a combination of belief and bureaucracy. Maps were tools of divine order, whether they were used to measure a farmer's plot or to map the afterlife. They served to ensure alignment with the gods, not only to help one find their path on earth. Although they did not create maps, the Greeks transformed the way that maps were conceptualized. For the first time in history, space was measured, computed, and analyzed in addition to being described. From being a practical requirement, geography evolved into an academic endeavor that would eventually serve as the foundation for contemporary cartography. Here comes Anaximander, a Miletus-born philosopher, who is recognized for producing one of the earliest mental maps of the world in the 6th century BCE. Sources characterize it as a round disk with geographical masses such as Europe and Asia dispersed around a center Mediterranean, although the original has been lost. In addition to being symbolic, it signaled a departure from legendary cosmologies. Anaximander was making an effort to rationally depict the physical universe. Hecataeus then arrived, honing these early concepts and extending them via exploration and travel. Periegesis, a geographical treatise that described places, customs, and peoples, was included with his map. However, centuries later, Claudius Ptolemy would completely alter the rules. A masterpiece of Greek knowledge, Ptolemy's Geographia was composed in the 2nd century CE. Long before GPS existed, it included a grid-based system of latitude and longitude, a list of over 8,000 place names with coordinates, and comprehensive map-making instructions. In order to depict the curving Earth on a flat surface, he also invented projections, a concept that still presents difficulties for contemporary cartographers. In addition to being useful tools, Greek maps provided insight into the Greek worldview. The Greeks positioned themselves at the intellectual center of the inhabited world, the oikoumene, which was encircled by oceans and barbarian territories. Geographical distortion increases with distance from Greece, suggesting both cultural bias and a lack of understanding. It's interesting to note that Greek philosophers also debated the notion of a spherical world. In the 3rd century BCE, Eratosthenes worked in Alexandria and used just geometry, shadows, and a stick to determine the circumference of the Earth. He was only a few hundred miles off, which was a remarkable accuracy. Drawing lines was only one aspect of Greek mapping. Deciphering the Earth's size, form, and position in the universe was the goal. The world will never be the same once the Greeks transformed maps from myth into science using reason, ambition, and mathematics. The Romans provided us with the complete military and logistical implementation of cartography, whereas the Greeks provided the theory. Laws and legions weren't the only things that kept the Roman Empire together. A large and well-maintained road system bonded it all together. The Romans produced some of the most useful and potent maps of the ancient world in order to maintain it in operation. Roman maps were based on movement as opposed to Greek maps, which sought to explore the skies or depict the Earth's shape. They served as instruments of supply, taxes, expansion, and control. "All roads lead to Rome" was the adage at the heart of it all. And that was a mapping philosophy, not a metaphor, to the Romans. The Tabula Peutingeriana, a 4th century CE replica of an even older Roman road map, is arguably the most well-known Roman map. Although land masses are stretched and distorted, making it not geographically accurate in the modern sense, it is ideal for its purpose. It illustrates connections, routes, stops, and distances throughout the empire from Britain to India. Consider a contemporary subway map where movement clarity is prioritized over spatial accuracy. That's the essence of Roman mapping. Regular intervals were used to designate way stations or mansions, along with the lengths in Roman miles. These maps made it possible for messengers, traders, and military leaders to move quickly over thousands of kilometers. They understood how long it would take to get to the next city, where to rest, and where to change horses. The empire became navigable on paper as well as in the field. The Romans also commissioned cadastral maps, which are extremely accurate records of property ownership and boundaries that are utilized in taxation and legal issues, in addition to road maps. To make it clear to the public who owned what, some were engraved in bronze and displayed in public areas. The Romans had a brutally clear understanding that power was derived from control of the land. It's interesting that they were constantly thinking about what they could conquer, travel, or tax. The map was a spreadsheet with highways on it, not a cosmic vision. Nevertheless, Roman maps gave rise to something timeless, a feeling of communal space and belonging to something more than your town or tribe by making the empire readable. It was utilitarian, meticulous, and mercilessly effective mapping as empire. Ancient Chinese cartography sought a balance between territory, governance, and the cosmos, whereas Roman maps placed a strong focus on highways and administration. Maps were never merely instruments for geography in China. They were also philosophical declarations, political papers, and heavenly mirrors. In order to properly govern the country and comprehend one's role in heaven, one must map it. Some of the oldest maps in China were found in tombs like the one at Mawangdui and date to the 4th century BCE. Incredibly detailed for their period, these silk maps depict roads, rivers, and military locations without being drawn to scale. They were buried with the dead, possibly to show the deceased's dominion over the land or to direct the spirit, but they weren't designed for travelers. Cartography had advanced by the time of the Han period, 226 BCE, 220 CE. Maps were used by officials to plan military campaigns, keep track of taxation zones, and administer the empire's numerous provinces. Sighting instruments and surveying tools like the groma made it possible to measure land with surprisingly high accuracy. Centuries before they were used in the West, some Han maps even featured coordinate grids. Pei Shu, who worked in the 3rd century CE, was one of the most important Chinese geographers. By focusing on scale, direction, and consistent measurement, he developed scientific map-making concepts that would eventually serve as the cornerstones of Chinese and Korean mapping traditions. He was known as the father of Chinese mapping because of how well regarded his work was. However, Chinese maps focused on more than just the land. The Chinese sky was charted in constellations arranged into celestial palaces and symbolic animals, such as the white tiger of the west and the blue dragon of the east, demonstrating the importance of cosmological charts. Everything from agriculture to imperial rights was regulated by these celestial maps. As the son of heaven, the emperor was thought to govern in accordance with the laws of heaven. His authority to reign would also be in conflict if his maps and, consequently, his administration were out of balance. The map was more than just a bureaucratic tool in China. Between heaven and earth, it served as a bridge. A map, whether it was etched into brass, drawn on silk, or carved into stone, symbolized more than just the territory. It demonstrated the emperor's capacity to bring order to the world's disarray. The Polynesians, who lived far from the great empires of Eurasia, created one of the most distinctive and abstract methods of world mapping. They relied on their intuitive memory and profound experience rather than on paper, ink, or scale. These were the Marshall Islands' stick maps, and they offered a completely new perspective on geography, one that was based on the sea rather than the land. Master navigators were the Polynesians. European explorers were sailing large swathes of the Pacific thousands of years before they crossed the Atlantic, using cloud patterns, swells, bird behavior, and stars to guide them. Their maps had to operate differently because they lacked written language and compasses. For apprentice navigators, they serve as tactile cues and memory aids rather than static pictures. Stick charts were constructed using wooden strips or thin coconut fronds that were tied together with thread. Ocean swells, which exhibited predictable behavior in open water, were depicted by the curves. Islands were identified by tiny knots or shells. Navigators could read the ocean's surface like a road map thanks to the stick's arrangement, which recorded wave refraction and interference patterns. There were various kinds of charts. Whereas meadow charts concentrated on particular trips or smaller areas, Rebolib charts covered entire archipelagos. The behavior of waves close to islands was then explained using matang, an abstract teaching method. These were not intended for use on ships. Rather, they were analyzed, internalized, and committed to memory. With just their senses and the knowledge they had gained from the stick map, a competent navigator could travel hundreds of kilometers. These maps appeared to be artworks or broken ladders to the inexperienced eye. To a Polynesian wayfinder, however, they symbolized profound ecological knowledge derived from a respectful and intimate relationship with nature rather than from conquest or geometry. The Western idea that a map must be literal and pictorial was contested by Polynesian mapping. Their maps were tangible, visceral, and frequently imperceptible while traveling. It was about feeling space, not about documenting it. These infographics blur the boundaries between spirituality and science in numerous ways. They were revered, protected by navigation schools, and transmitted orally. They assisted the Polynesians in finding their way not only across water but also through memory, rhythm, and ancient knowledge in an ocean that could swallow even the most daring sailor. Map interpretation started to change from scientific observation to symbolic interpretation when the ancient world gave way to the medieval age. Cartography became less about physical precision and more about expressing spiritual truths in various parts of the world, particularly in Europe. The outcome? Maps with devils, monsters, paradise, and a world-view in which the center of belief frequently coincided with the center of geography. The TO map, which dominated European thought from the early Middle Ages to the Renaissance, is among the most recognizable examples of a medieval map. With Asia at the top, Europe at the bottom left, and Africa at the bottom right, these maps showed the world as a circle, the O, that was split into 3 sections by a T. Jerusalem frequently occupied the center, strengthening the world's religious core. Because the Garden of Eden was thought to be toward the east rather than the north, east was typically at the top. Navigation was not intended for these maps. They served as theological instruments supporting a Christian worldview in which the geography of the planet matched the events of the Bible. The names of Noah's sons were used to identify the lands, and the uncharted areas outside the borders were inhabited by hideous races, people with faces in their chests, feet like umbrellas or dog heads. Things became stranger the farther they were from Jerusalem. However, not all maps from the Middle Ages were only metaphorical. Some, such as the 12th century Tabula Rogeriana by Arab geographer al-Idrisi, fused artistic flair with scientific observation. Interviews with travelers, traders, and sailors from the Muslim and Christian cultures served as the basis for this enormous silver map, which was commissioned by a Norman ruler in Sicily. It ranked south at the top, a frequent practice in Islamic mapping, and was significantly more practical and precise than its European counterparts. In the meantime, conceptual world maps that were more concerned with metaphysical structure than navigation were also created by the Jewish, Indian, and Buddhist traditions. For example, Mount Meru, encircled by symbolic continents and holy realms, was depicted as the cosmic axis on numerous Indian and Tibetan maps. These medieval maps serve as a reminder that mapping encompasses more than just physical locations. It also reflects people's perceptions of the world. The map was more than simply a guide. It was a mirror of the soul in a time when mystery and dread still loomed over the horizon. As humans' perceptions of the world expanded, so did our need to comprehend it, not just to move from point A to point B, but also to comprehend our origins, identity, and surroundings. With all of its imperfections, distortions, and symbols, ancient maps set the stage for the modern world's fixation with borders, space, and accuracy. Intention, not accuracy, is what unites all old maps. Babylonian tablets depicted the spiritual structure of the universe, not how to find a street. In a land ruled by gods and floods, Egyptian maps assisted priests and tax collectors in upholding divine order. Scale, geometry, and the audacious notion that the world could be measured were all introduced by Greek maps. By enabling legions, messengers, and merchants to operate like clockwork, Roman road maps helped to knit together a huge empire. Chinese maps, which always aimed to depict balance between heaven and earth, combined astronomy with administration. Then there were the outliers, the tactile and abstract Polynesian stick charts that demonstrated that not all maps needed to be seen, but rather that some were meant to be felt and recalled, and the religious maps from the Middle Ages that depicted animals and paradise and explained to viewers not just the location of the world, but also its significance. Even the imperfections on old maps teach us something. They reveal what was important to a society, what was feared, what was revered, and what was centered. These maps serve as a reminder that geography is never neutral. It always represents power, myth, memory, and priorities. The Greeks, Chinese, and Europeans all positioned themselves in the center. Every individual was the focal point of their own universe. These days, we can map the entire planet down to the last meter, thanks to satellite imagery and digital accuracy. The fundamental motivation for mapping, however, is still the same as it was thousands of years ago: the human urge to place oneself in a larger context. Every map, whether it be on a luminous phone screen, a clay tablet, or a papyrus scroll, provides an answer to the same age-old query: where am I?